We are often faced with challenges or discrimination. How has Angie Morgan leveraged her experience in the Marine Corps to the private sector and now helps people to take risk? Let's find out. Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Behus, and today we are going to interview Angie Morgan. And Angie is an expert on risk-taking in the context of leadership. Angie, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Burris. Nice to meet you. Nice to be here.
So tell us how you define risk-taking and why is it important?
That's a really great question to start because through my research on risk-taking, I've learned that a lot of people just don't really grasp the concept. A lot of people say, I'm really risk-averse. And then when you look at their lives, you've seen that they've taken a lot of risk they're now enjoying. So it's really important to start at the basis. And that is risk is really just a decision followed by action that leads you into uncertainty. And some of the biggest risks that we've taken in life, I would say, include for those of you who are married, it's a huge risk. Chances of success are only 50%. That's a crazy risk. And yet, again, people send you off with Christmas china and candlesticks with those odds. It's amazing. Or having kids, or even going to college, or making your first career choice. So we take a lot of risk all the time. Even, again, not going to the doctor on a regular basis. It's a huge risk. We take risks all the time. And so if risk is all around us, it's really important to really understand that it's just a decision followed by action that leads us into uncertainty.
So why is it important? I mean, okay, we take a lot of risks, sometimes not the best risk, but what would you say, why is it important in a leadership role?
I speak with leaders all the time. I spend likely about 75% of my time leadership coaching executives all over the country. And what I discover is that there's always something in the back of their mind or in their heart that they've wanted to do for a very long time, but haven't had the courage or the confidence to do it. And these aren't outlandish dreams. These are starting, investing in a franchise locally. So again, keeping your current role, but putting some money in a local franchise, maybe with a business partner to have some sort of side hustle or additional income. That scares people. That fear prevents them from taking that risk. Even starting new exercise routines or having conversations that are really, really critical to the long-term success of relationships. I think about the risks that, I've had in my life and what's prevented me, and it's always come down to fear. There's a lot of fears.
Okay, give me an example.
Of risks in my life?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so last summer, my husband and I did just that. We bought a coffee shop. So he had a full-time job. I still have a full-time job. I run my business. And on the side, we had this really amazing opportunity to buy a coffee shop from a couple of friends of ours. And it took a bit to convince ourselves that this was, in fact, that we wanted to do. And it's scary, especially trying to hire in this labor market and learn baking, learn how to make espresso drinks. But so again, just really grappling with our fears, we went ahead and did it. And we're still learning every single day. And like any risk, it doesn't exactly turn out how you want it to be, but you find joy and fulfillment in the journey.
Okay, so there's a risk being an entrepreneur for sure. Taking a risk, they need something else to make sure that you have more potential reward than risk. At least that's my assumption. What would you say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important risks that we can take are the ones that are most important to us. I think the world will give us plenty of cues on what it is we should be doing with our time, with our money, with our experience. But the reward comes from really identifying what it is that you want to do and having the courage to recognize that it's going to require some sort of trade-off of your time, of your money, of your resources. But the reward is that you find fulfillment in the hustle or the challenge. I've always said to folks, life is going to be challenging no matter what road you take. But choosing the road you take is the most important because you want the struggle to at least be enjoyable.
So you were in the military for 4 years. And what did you learn in the Marine Corps that you applied to the corporate world?
So when I left active duty in early 2000. And what surprised me most coming into the private sector was how the term leader was used. In the military, everybody learns at a very early stage of their training that they're leaders, not because they're in charge of people, even if it's just leading yourself. And so it was really this verb. It was an action. Everybody strived to be leaders, and everyone was a leader. So then working in the private sector, recognizing that leaders were only managers and leadership was a noun. It was talked as if it was a place on an organization chart. So that was really my aha moment to take, I would say, a really big risk at the time with my business partner. Now we'd served together in the Marine Corps. We had a conversation one day and wanted just for tossing around the ideas of writing a book together. It ended up being Leading from the Front, our first book, but it just started with a conversation saying, if not us, then who? We see people write books all the time. If we can't do it, who gets to? And so that was, a risk, physical risk joining the Marine Corps, but then a different type of risk, starting a business, writing a book.
And what is the key concept in Leading from the Front?
We wrote that book for women professionals. So it's Leading from the Front with the subtitle, No Excuse Leadership Tactics for Women. It was 10 leadership principles taken straight from the Marine Corps and applicable for a women's experience. Like we write about not crying over something that won't prior review, or even talking about language, only saying you're sorry when you're at fault. So we tried to give women just some really practical ways to think how to harness, their emotions and present themselves best going forward with their careers, with their lives.
And what would you say is the difference between women's leadership and men's leadership?
The principles and concepts are very similar. Like what makes me influential would make a man influential. It's really just the expression of it. I, didn't write the rules about work, but if we've heard this one before, like if a man cries at work, he's very passionate. It's a little bit more forgivable. But if a woman cries at work, it has a different reputation reaction for that. And so just, having that level of awareness that, there are emotions that we just have to pay attention to. So I think it's more about the expression of leadership.
I see. You also went to what you call ROTC. It's a training for military officers. What did you learn there that you think is uniquely applicable to the military, and what you learned there that could be applicable to the corporate world?
When I was getting my English degree at the University of Michigan, I was also training to be a Marine Corps officer through the ROTC program. It's called Reserve Officer Training Corps Program. So it was this concurrent pursuit to get my degree. And what I learned in that process in our school's fight song is we call ourselves leaders and best. But through my experience in the Marine Corps, it wasn't the degree that makes you the leader, it was your behavior. So that was one of my biggest takeaways at college. And I really benefited too. So learning in the Marine Corps, becoming a Marine Corps officer, you're learning about ethics, integrity, decision-making, all these skills that, we call soft skills. But if you work, a day or two in the corporate world, you know that these are the things that matter most in regards to a culture. So I'm learning how to demonstrate these skills while pursuing my degree. And it was a really important time to learn that. It provided a really great foundation for me as a young leader, preparing to take on significant responsibility in the Marine Corps.
What was it like to be a woman in the military training?
That's a loaded question. So I could answer that 700 different ways. It was, at first, it was very extreme. There's 174,000 Marines and only 1,000 are female officers. And so it's pretty shocking when you realize that, if you're in the field, you could be the only woman for quite some time. And I think too, as a woman, you realize after a while, you don't even notice it, but that doesn't mean you aren't noticed as the only female. But I learned at that time too, that, having really good boundaries was very important as a minority in an organization. Being really, really clear with people with how they can talk to you and how they can't. You've often heard, or maybe people assume, like sexual harassment or those types of things happen in the Marine Corps. I just learned to be, when you could be really clear with people, to say like, hey, you can't really talk to me like that. I don't want to hear that again. They stop. And so I just learned great boundary management. Who knew?
That's interesting. Good for you, Angie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from the start, telling them, this is okay, this is not okay, so that also they learn.
Mm-hmm. And it solves more problems. We don't have to escalate anything. You now know, I know, we're cool.
Yeah. Have you applied that in the corporate world?
I think the same thing. I mean, when I coach executives, that's one of the very first things that happen. Most people do have relationships that are less than best, that they need trust and reliance and cooperation from. And there are a lot of people who just haven't set really clear boundaries. Maybe they've accepted things in the past and then suddenly they don't like how they're treated. So just teaching people about, putting up firmer boundaries, sitting with the discomfort, because as you change, your relationships change, and not everybody likes the change you make within yourself, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but helping navigate and support them through. Like, again, if I've tolerated something in a relationship and suddenly I say to you, hey, I don't really want you talking to me like that anymore. Please don't say this. It can be startling. It can shift the dynamic of the relationship. It can have a chilling effect. It can be awkward.
Yes, absolutely. So you mentioned that there's 3 misconceptions about risk. What would that be?
Yeah. And to make the point too, having those conversations is taking a huge risk in your relationships. The things that were most interesting when Courtney and I, my co-author, were doing the research on risk is that first and foremost, the biggest misconception first is that we tend to think of risk versus reward, like it's the opposite of reward, like it's the downside of a choice. But if we think of some of the greatest things that happened in our life, like getting married, like having children, like enjoying our careers, we recognize that no, risk isn't the opposite of reward. It's the path to reward. Some of the greatest things we're enjoying right now were because of a big risk we took at one point in life. The second is that risk is a series of steps. It's not a leap. In our American society, we tend to really celebrate big, bold choices, rip the Band-Aid, quit your job, change your life. We love 90 Day Fiancé. Like, we love big things, but those are often train wrecks. Those are often really irresponsible risks. We're advocates for responsible risk. So to start taking risks and taking really good risks, it starts with a thought. It then develops the belief. It then develops behavior. It goes through a process. So if you're really trying to do something in your life to make change, start small, build the muscle.
So here you're saying that risk, you got to take it, but your caveat is that you start small. Give us the process again, and then you develop action.
Yeah, so thoughts become beliefs, become behaviors. Great example, I said at the beginning of the show, my husband and I, bought a coffee shop. We, and it wasn't just out of the blue, we bought a coffee shop. And the story really went like, we were in Key West. We had a great breakfast at this little fantastic place. It was such a powerful memory. We spent our time in Key West thinking, oh, what if we were to do this? And so we had the seed, the thought planted. And then we started, doing some research on what it would take. And then we recognized the skills that we had and the skills that we didn't have. And so when the opportunity came up for us to buy the business, it was really exciting. Like, we'd done the thinking, we've done the beliefs, we got the courage and the confidence. So the acting wasn't so difficult. It still wasn't comfortable. There still was some fear baked into it, but we were bought into the process. I can think of many risks that, people take that aren't just going to pan out because they haven't went through a process to really buy in. It's like starting a fad diet with little knowledge. It's probably not going to work. Or buying a gym membership on a whim because you have an idea, or even like the late night infomercials, all the things that you see there, right? Like, seems like great ideas, but they probably aren't going to succeed because you haven't done the thought work behind it.
So you say thought, belief, and behavior. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about belief.
Belief to me is the courage and confidence that you can do it. So again, the thought is likely the idea. The belief is the self-reliance and the confidence and the courage that it's possible. And then that transitions into the behaviors that make it so.
Just so the belief is really that you can do it, but you mentioned in your process that you did research, you checked out your skill set, you've done a lot of thinking about it. So would you call that, the belief?
Absolutely. I think that's what gives you the courage and confidence to be self-reliant, to believe that it's possible, to believe that it can be done by you.
So the belief of it is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. And what's the next risk? You said there's 3.
The final. Great. Thank you for keeping me on track. I get so excited talking. I could go off track really quickly. The third misconception about risk is we think we can avoid it. And that's just the reality. We are surrounded by risk. I mean, we're all coming through this really crazy pandemic world. Nobody well, maybe science fiction fans saw it coming, but I certainly didn't see it coming. Like, we think that we can plan, prepare for everything, and therefore it's going to happen that way. But that's just not the case. Just because we're living, breathing means that inherent risk is going to be present in our life. And so rather than avoid it, this thing that is going to be surrounded by us, wouldn't it be in our best interest to learn how to embrace it, to understand it, and to really look at risk, not just, from maybe one area of our life, like physical, but what about financial? What about risking for values? What about relational? Just to really get comfortable with our personal risk disposition to see where then there could be growth for us. It's interesting. You meet people who will take a risk for their values, but maybe they're not going to take the risk to negotiate for a pay raise. That's important to know about yourself. Or maybe there's a person who, I know many Marines in the Marine Corps who would, jump on a grenade to save their team, but they wouldn't spend $10,000 to open up a franchise or go back to get a certificate program because that was too great of a risk. So it's really just trying to understand where you're most comfortable taking risks and maybe perhaps where you're not.
So the process is to really understand yourself, where you're able to take a life risk and yet where you're shy of taking some other risk. Why is that important in the process?
So if I'm in negotiations, maybe for a salary with a new job, and I know that I'm not comfortable taking financial risk, I may need to talk to a mentor. I maybe need to challenge myself. I maybe need to do a little bit more research to better advocate for myself in this position in a salary negotiation. So that would be one way. So really just understanding where you're most comfortable taking risk and maybe where some of your gaps are and figuring out how to shore those gaps when the time matters so you don't leave opportunity or maybe even money on the table.
Great. So where do you start? You have an interesting concept or approach to it, because usually what you do is what do you want, and then say what is the risk, and then how can you elevate that risk so that you're comfortable to go into action. So here you say maybe where do you start taking risk, instead of saying where do you start to really have your biggest dream come true and verbalize that. So how do you approach that?
That's one of the things when we were writing Bet on You that was really exciting for us too, because we wanted people to really recognize that there's areas which we call this the kaleidoscope approach. There's 4 areas in your life where you can certainly direct and exercise your risk. It's, risking in your career, risking for your life to include your family, risking for joy. That's something I talk to a lot of busy professionals. They don't do enough just for their own personal fun. For example, I love taking my 2 boys to watch a Marvel comic movie, but that's not for me. That's for them. If given that time, I'd probably do something very different. So I do things that are fun, but maybe not my flavor of fun. And then the final is risking for service, just to think about how we can be more service culture oriented. Trying to think about the communities in which we live. I think that's a really critical component to a well-rounded life in. And then thinking about in those 4 areas, what are our dreams and aspirations for ourselves? We don't dream enough. Most times that we have to dream are probably used on our phone. Think about waiting rooms in doctor offices. You step into one of those and it could be one of the most important daydreaming experiences, but you see everybody, scrolling through their phone on social media, not paying attention to themselves, but taking cues from external sources of perhaps how to be living their life. And so trying to unmoor your mind and really get back in touch with your dreams is a really critical element to start developing the direction you want to take some of these risks.
So that's an important point, that to be back in touch into your dreams and have quiet moments that doesn't entail looking at your phone or your social media, but just quiet moments to think and see outside of your everyday life, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And listen to yourself. Get back in touch with yourself. And I would say that during the pandemic, perhaps a lot of people did do that because many of us had more time, or at least having the disruption of our schedule, that we found a little bit more time to dream again. and paying attention to those dreams are really great indicators on what it is we personally would like to do. And so then going through the process. So once you really can clarify your dreams, then with Bet on You, we start talking about what's holding you back. Is it something external? Probably more than likely it's something internal. And then realizing who can help you. So finding your champions, finding your supporters, finding, influencers like what you're doing here with your podcast, finding the people who can get in your ear and give you the courage and confidence to empower yourself. And then finding the time. We write a little bit about that too in Bet on You, is carving out some white space in your life so you can start to find the time to put a plan together, to try and attempt to do the things that you want to do. If it is the thing that you want to do is run a 10K, you're going to need some time to get some shoes and hit the road. So having that time and finding that time and using that time for the risk taking, small steps that you want to take is important.
So just define 10K for our European listeners.
Oh, yes. So a 6-mile run, 10 kilometers.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the end of our podcast. What last tip could you give our listeners?
Most people's dreams aren't outlandish. And if that sounds like you, that the dream in the back of your mind isn't outlandish, just ask yourself, if not you, then who? If you can't do it, you with all your talent, your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge, if you can't do it, who gets to? And I'd like to share too, with the book, we have a Bet on You, what we call a risk companion. That is an online tool that you can start to go into a portal, get some really thoughtful questions that really challenge you. And when you're done, you get a printout of really what we would call your risk manifesto, how to go about pursuing the dreams that matter to you most. So start looking inside yourself first, believing that you can. And then we've got all sorts of resources for you to help you achieve that.
Wonderful. Where can people get a hold of you?
They can either find me on LinkedIn, Angie Judge Morgan, or visit leadstar.us.
Okay. Thank you so very much, Angie. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We would love to know what you thought of this podcast. Write us an email at drkatrina with a K at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. We would love to hear what you liked and what we could improve. This podcast has been sponsored by excellentexecutivecoaching.com.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burris' CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.